into the sea, mountains into the sea.
Welcome to the Our State Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Wiley Cash. In today's episode with best-selling author Ron Rash, we talk about his early life in North Carolina, his path to becoming a best-selling author, and his obsession with cemeteries. This episode was recorded live in front of an audience at the Asheville Ideas Fest.
Ron, I wonder if we could start with you telling us a little bit about The Caretaker and a little bit about where the idea for the novel came from.
Okay. I think in some ways this is my oldest novel because about 35 years ago, a friend of mine told me an incredible story. It was actually in South Carolina. A young woman had married, she was about 16 or 17, had married a young man a couple of years older from a prominent family in this small town. And the parents were outraged. They were trying to stop the marriage. What happened was they eloped, were still in that general area, and he got drafted into World War II. And while he was gone, the parents had her murdered and told him that she had died of natural causes. And this is where, this is what you love as a writer. My friend said, well, it kind of got blurry after that. I'm not sure if he ever found out. I do know that there were people in the community who realized the truth of it. And I said, that's fine. I can go the rest of the way myself. You've given me all I want. And so that story had been in my head, pretty much half my life. And I just never had been able to get it to work. It just never would work. And along with that, I've always wanted to write a novel set on my grandparents' farm between Blowing Rock and Boone, because that was a place that was hugely important to me growing up. I spent so much of my childhood there, my summers, and I'd always wanted to write a book about that place also. And I never could, I'd written a number of novels, but I never could use that place. But I guess, it's been 7 years ago. It always starts with an image for me. I had an image of it was late night in a cemetery, and a young woman was kneeling. She was in mourning clothes. She was kneeling before a gravestone with her name on it. And I felt, okay, I've got it, or I thought I had it then. And what was interesting, in the initial drafts, she was indeed murdered. But as I got into the book, I started thinking, well, should she be murdered or not? I kind of thought, well, what if she wasn't murdered? Well, maybe. And I kind of, in a sense, I just kept going back and forth. I'm not going to tell you which one I settled on, but that was kind of where it started. And I just kept getting wrong turns. I wrote over 1,000 pages, and the book is only about 256. So it was very frustrating in some ways.
Yeah. So two things that I want to circle back on. First, I'm so glad this is a live podcast recording, because when Ron said that the woman was murdered by her beloved's parents, half the audience went, oh! And, our previous podcasts have been around like Lee Smith's kitchen table, Charles Frazier's living room. There's nobody there to gasp, except me, and sometimes I do. And then I want to circle back on what you said of the woman standing, the vision you had of the woman standing at her own grave. Was there a moment when you thought, oh my gosh, am I writing a ghost story?
Yeah, and I mean it.
You heard it here first, folks. Ron Rash, horror writer.
Yep. Yeah, and in a sense, I hope in some ways it is a kind of ghost story. Yeah. I mean, you know what I mean by that. But I just kind of thought those elements, those kind of gothic elements would be interesting. I've always been a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe. This is also my most optimistic novel. I mean, it's funny. I was telling I was describing this book to somebody and they started laughing. So this is when he's happy, right? I don't know if you get this, but people think I'm like undeniably grim. I actually had a woman at USC ask me, University of South Carolina. She said, "Well, does your psychiatrist go with you?" And I had a friend who was in the audience, one of my closest. Actually, the guy told me that story I just said. And I said, well, yeah, I brought him with me. Dr. Moore, stand up. And he stood up. And I think she believed that. Anyway, we digress, yeah.
People have accused me of being dark, writing dark stuff. And my novel, The Last Ballad, there's a scene that I find quite funny where a guy meets a little boy on the side of the road, and the boy's dog bites at the guy. And I cited that. I said, that scene was kind of funny. And somebody responded and said, that dog had been run over. And that's why it was biting that guy. I was like, well, tomato. I want to circle back on a couple of things. You talked about the image that compelled you to enter into this novel. And I know with Serena, the image you had was of a woman on horseback on a ridge, and that stayed with you.
Yeah.
What are some other images that you can point to? I'm thinking about Saints at the River, One Foot in Eden. But where do these images come from? Are they, and when do they come? I can say that my freest thinking comes in that moment as I'm easing into sleep. And that's when I tend to think about my writing maybe the most clearly and the most unfettered. So when do these images kind of come to you? Do they come when you're reading? Do they come when you're reading poetry, listening to music? When did they come?
Well, that's interesting because you were talking about going to sleep. When I wrote my first novel, One Foot in Eden, I was actually dreaming. I had a dream, and I was coming out of the dream, and the dream was of a farmer standing in a field, and his crops were dying around him, but I knew that something else was dying. It actually was his marriage, and so that started that one. My second novel, Saints at the River, began with an image of a child's face looking up through water. And I got a feeling you'll agree with me on this. I think there's a part of it, and I think with most art, that is kind of mysterious. I'm kind of a Jungian, and I think in some ways that the stories, it's almost like, it's not, sometimes it's just like we get on that wavelength, the story's out there. Now I know that sounds kind of crazy, but it's, those images just come to me, and I mean, I'd never, like with Serena, I'd never even imagined this woman on horseback who was this dynamic woman who would end up being, kind of a, very frightening character, but I don't know where that came from. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm sure, get that psychiatrist back in, but it just, they just seem to come. And I think maybe part of being a writer, maybe being an artist in a way is just, for some reason, just kind of allowing yourself that dream time. Yeah. And I think what a novel is, in a sense, for all the craft, what it does, I think, when you're writing it, when you're reading it, it's a waking dream.
Yeah. And I think that when we think about the work existing in some ways outside of us, it keeps us constantly focusing on the fact that we're in service of the work, that we're not really wrestling the work out of us. We're paying attention to where the work is leading us. And for me personally, it keeps me from feeling very precious about my writing. Yeah. It never feels precious. And when a book comes out, I just kind of release it. Yeah. And it's like it didn't happen to me, it really belonged to me, and I don't, not that I don't think about it anymore. I mean, you have to when you go on book tour, you do an event like this, but it's not really part of me in a strange way. It's like has passed through, and we did our work together, and now it's kind of moved on. The new book, and you mentioned Saints at the River, the opening of that, and correct me if I'm mistaken, Ron, it's this girl slipping into the river, and she thinks she's just going to wade, and then she slips, and before you know it, she knows it, she's drowning. And there's this beautiful small moment where she thinks about the aquarium and her classroom and the direction of the bubbles, I think, and the sound of water. And it's such an arresting, heartbreaking, but beautiful image. The Caretaker opens with our hero, Jacob Hampton, right? Jacob Hampton, on the DMZ in North Korea during the war. And he goes hand to hand with a North Korean soldier, a sniper, on an icy river. And it is probably the most intense physical writing I've seen from you. Can you talk about beginning a book with that opening as opposed to a kind of more metaphysical, thinky opening like Saints at the River?
Yeah, actually we had a question this morning, I think tied in this, a younger writer, probably a writer, you had that sense about him, how do you make these decisions? And that actually, in my early drafts, that was not the opening. But this is kind of the character I was talking about. He's the young man. He's been drafted. Instead of World War II, I made it Korea because that's a war I think sometimes is forgotten. I had a relative who was a Marine in it, and this character who's come from this prominent family has been, I think this is where we really get, why is it important? I mean, one, you want to get the audience interested. So you have an intense battle scene to try to draw the reader in. But also, I wanted a scene where we see him where, for the first time in his life, the veneer slipped away. And he's on this ice, about ready. He thinks he's going to die, may die. North Korean, they're knife fighting. And he has kind of been, his family's almost talked him out of loving this woman that he's, that they're so against. And everything else is stripped away except for her. And he realizes that's the one thing. And so in a sense, I think a lot of times what we want to do is we want to get to that moment where the mask is pulled back and with our characters. And so I felt like that scene was doing, several things, getting us into the story, setting up his, but also it's ultimately about kind of revelation of character too.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of times, I like what you said just now about that opening scene is going to be tension-filled and it's going to hook the reader. Oftentimes with young writers, especially like the ones I work with here at the university, they think the way to hook the reader is to set the stakes emotionally, but if there's no physicality brought to the emotion is abstract and it's amorphous, and you can't hand something it's like handing a beanbag to somebody and saying, shape this into a pencil or a tripod. You can't do it because it's boggy and amorphous. But if you put someone in physical danger and you bring a physicality, a tactile feeling to the writing, and then say, oh, he's fighting because he loves this woman, and he may lose her if he doesn't survive this. Suddenly, when you say, here's this emotion, I know exactly what it means. I know exactly what he's going to risk. So the sooner you can get to that tactile physicality, the sooner we will understand the emotional stakes. I think that's across all genres, poetry, nonfiction, certainly. I want to talk a little bit about your writing process, if you'll indulge us. You've been really prolific. You've published a novel or a story collection or a collection of poems almost every couple of years for almost 3 decades. What is your writing process? And do you find yourself, I know this was the case with The Caretaker, taking breaks to work on other projects that creep in? Or do you write poetry when you're writing a novel? Or do you just return to the same unfinished field every day and be like, I guess I'm digging more holes in the same field?
Yeah, I tend to do, if I'm working on short stories, I work on short stories. If I work on poems, I work on poems. It's almost like being on, I guess, a different frequency, and I can't be on them all at the same time. But I was an athlete in high school and also in college, and actually a year or two beyond that, and I've always kind of been very disciplined. I think that's one thing that maybe made up for lack of talent in other ways, but I've just tried to, I'm slowing down some now. I've noticed in the last couple of years, but pretty much I write every day, some, and I've tried to write for a while, many years, pretty much every day, and I'm very ritualistic. I do certain things the same way. I get the big glass of iced tea, I get the pencils, everything. But I like that idea of ritual, but also just the sense that it's a way of making this such a normal part of my day.
Yeah.
And when I say that, I know different writers who don't work that way. I know writers who sometimes don't write for weeks, but that's what works for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I met you in person, Ron, was at the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. It was before my first book came out. It would have been probably the fall of 2011. It was in Charleston. It was a big trade show. And they have this trade show floor where all the novels are set up and all the authors with books coming out that season are there. And I was at the Harper table with Tom Franklin. And you came down and we were making small talk. It's the first time I'd met you. I think Tommy knew you. You all met before. And you went off to do something and Tommy leaned over and said, "He's already written 3 hours today." And I'm standing there with my first novel and I hadn't done anything in a couple of weeks and I'm like, man, this is going to be way harder than I thought it was.
Well, maybe just, harder for me. Yeah,
No.
Yeah, I just had to, that's what works for me.
No, I love that. I love that blue collar kind of approach to work, that we don't wait until the idea comes. We don't wait until the inspiration comes. And I remember once I was with Jess Walter, who's a fantastic novelist and short story writer and nonfiction writer. And I said, how have you written so many different kinds of things? And he said, because you can always write something. He said, it might not be the story you're working on. It might not be the article you're under deadline for. You can always write something. And I've kind of found that to be true for me. So The Caretaker features more points of view in a single work than I've ever seen from you before. And it's got this really tight plot. I mean, John Grisham has a blurb on the back, and John Grisham is, the plot master. And if he's praising your plot, you've done something good. But it also has these incredibly rich characterizations, and there's a lot of points of view. How did you make that decision to include that many points of view, and how did you decide who to leave in and who to take out?
Well, that's why I wrote over 1,000 pages because it just, I just kept, I kept getting the wrong characters. The character that I came to feel like the book's probably most about is Blackburn Gant, and he's the caretaker of the cemetery, and for a couple of years he wasn't even a character, and I just finally realized that in a way it was kind of the story. He was at the center of the story, but every time I write a novel, I want to do something different. I want to try something I've never done before in certain ways, and this was one where I thought, I really kind of want to go with these multiple points of view and see if I can work that. And I wanted it to, really feel like a tight book. And that's where I think writing so much and then trying to decide, okay, what can I cut out? What can I cut out? What can I cut out? And and I think one thing that I've come to love is from other writers. I was thinking of Toni Morrison. She has a character one time that just shows up like in 3 pages, and I cannot forget that character. I've been rereading Faulkner's Absalom, and there's a French architect who's only really in one scene, and he's completely memorable. And I've tried, in this novel, I think more than any of the others, I've got a couple of, a doctor, and they're not major characters, but you hope that the reader feels like they become real.
Yeah, and I think having the characters and the caretaker the way you do, the doctor's a great example. It's reading about the small moments of this doctor's life. There's the moment in the cafe where he's at the table. It just really brings so much evocative atmosphere. We talked about regional writers are one who truly portray a place, and that's certainly what you do in The Caretaker. This is my last question before we hit the North Carolina lightning round again. But you said, not just to me, but you think this might be your last novel. because took so much to get it done and took so many years to get it done. Although your wife Ann is here, and she said, "Boy, I've heard that before."
Yeah, she has. I think 7 times. Man?
She said, "You should see our dining room table right now, where he's writing a story. All the papers on the table." But can you talk about the scope of your career and what you're interested, at least right now, going to? What's drawing you back to the work right now?
Right. Yeah. And I'm I am continuing to write. I'm actually writing short stories now, and I love short stories. That's actually my favorite form, if I had to choose one. But yeah, I think one thing that the reason I feel like this is a novel I want to conclude with, I feel like it's a novel that would be best for me to conclude with, is that it's the one that is about the place I probably love the most, my grandparents' farm. That farm, we're getting a little bit off here, but my father had severe mental health problems, and that was a place I went to, to stay there when I was growing up. And it offered me this place. So I always wanted to write about that place. But the other thing I wanted to do is write a book of that, and particularly because of the world we're living in right now in this country is so stratified. I wanted to write a book that was hopeful. And one thing that's interesting I found out is that a lot of writers, as they get late in their careers, they've been into the darkest areas of the heart, the tragic, and then I think it's almost like you want to give a kind of gift to the reader, a little bit of hope, a little bit of light. Shakespeare with Winter's Tale, Tempest. Those after the darkness of Lear, where it's just totally dark. Macbeth. He kind of brings us back into the light. Cheever with Falconer, a writer I love. His last novel, Last Words Rejoice. Faulkner with The Reivers, and his a comic, more of a comic novel. So I wanted a book that would kind of I feel like inspire, maybe not inspire, but would kind of remind us that there are people who are decent in the world. There can be. They're always the Bonhoeffers of the world.
Yeah.
The people that will make that sacrifice.
So, got some lightning round questions to ask.
All right, I'm ready.
No thought, just responses. Question number 1 in our North Carolina lightning round: what is one meal for you that is synonymous with North Carolina?
Boy, I'm gonna have to go with barbecue. I'm sorry. I know that's a cliche.
Here's the real divisive question.
Okay.
From where and what kind?
Oh yeah. That's caused some real problems in my family. My wife is one of those mustard eaters.
Mustard eaters.
So I'm a Shelby Bridges barbecue fellow, and the one on the interstate. There are 2 of them. So
not the one downtown.
For the aficionados. I was in the liver mush capital of the world, but I wasn't a big fan of liver mush, so I stayed away from that. But sweet potato pie, that's So I think those are the meals that I remember.
Yeah. Oh, I love some liver mush. Liver mush on a biscuit with some mustard, fried up in a pan, get it nice and crispy.
They're not buying that.
Yeah. Another question I've got for you: is there a North Carolina author who's been a sort of mentor to you?
Well, gosh, there is a kind of holy trinity for me. Lee Smith, she taught at North Carolina State a long time. Great writer, very kind to me, always very encouraging. Helped me get my job at Western. Very good person. Fred Chappell was very generous to me at the beginning. Robert Morgan, I think the best poet in the country. Grew up in Green River near Hendersonville. Yeah, they were very kind to me. I learned from their writing, obviously. They all wrote about the Southern Appalachian Mountains, but they were very generous. And I'd have to go with those. I'd have,
Yeah.
3 in 1,
Well, I know the booksellers who've had big influences on you, and one of them was Nancy Olson down at Quail Ridge Books in Raleigh for those Triangle folks. And I'll never forget when my first book came out, I went down to Quail Ridge on book tour, and Nancy pulled me aside. She said, "Well, I got to let you know, Ron Rash is my boyfriend, but you can be my boyfriend too." And I said, "Whatever it takes, Nancy. Let's move some books."
Yeah, and I think that's why, I'm a mid-list writer, and those independent bookstores
Oh my gosh,
are just
yeah.
crucial for us.
Yeah,
and
lifeblood.
continue to be.
Yeah. Our people find out about our books because a bookseller cares to put it in their hand. You're not gonna go to that website named after a river and find our books because you're gonna see the blockbusters there that are the perennial books that everybody knows about. So those indie stores, so support Malaprops and Flyleaf and Quail Ridge and all these great stores. And it's so funny, someone mentioned Mississippi, the Mississippi Book Festival, and Ron and I are rattling off all these indie stores in Mississippi because that's how I know places, is I know where the indie stores are in these towns. My last lightning round question is, what's the most fun you've ever had while researching?
That's a good question. Okay, yeah. I would probably say the most fun was when I wrote Serena. She's a woman who pretty much runs a timber camp. Woman in the late 1920s, very formidable. I wanted to be almost like a Wagnerian character, like a Valkyrian, just kind of come down to earth. But I needed something that would make her, to these rough mountain men, loggers, something that they would be impressed by, and not just impressed, maybe in awe, A-W-E, awe of. And so I was thinking, at first I thought, okay, I'll have her go out and shoot rattlesnakes. Okay, that's somewhat. Now I thought, well, maybe she can I'll have her train a dog that can sniff them out. And that would be something, because those men would be afraid of it. And I thought, but I want her to be kind of mythic. And I'd seen a hawk grab a snake in the woods, country, and I thought, what if she could train an eagle to hunt rattlesnakes? And I don't know where that came from, but I thought, would that be possible? And this is kind of a game I used to play where I would call, I called the National Falconry Association. And, I just kind of said, like, well, this is Ron Rash down in North Carolina. I've got a question. and they what they did, and this is one of the funny things about research, they kept kind of sending me to different people to get rid of me. But finally, one of the women said, well, you need to talk to Todd. And when you get a first name, you found the person you're looking for.
Yeah, specialists only go by first name.
Yeah,
Oh, you did Jerry.
Yeah, and they're all the same. And the first thing, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, that the first thing they do is they tell you immediately that you're not intelligent enough to understand anything I'm going to tell you about this eagle. But this guy, he actually was one of 12 people in the United States at that time who hunted with an eagle in Wyoming. He hunted jackrabbits with it, but we kind of, after he got past the, being, condescending stage, and they can't help themselves. Once they start talking about it, they can't stop. But and I really was interested. I thought it was he said, well, you need to make it a bear goot. And I said, I didn't know what a bear goot was. And that's a Mongolian eagle. That's the eagle Kublai Khan hunted with. It's the most revered hunting eagle in the world. And he sent me some clips, and I don't know if you've seen these birds, if you know about these birds, but they hunt wolves with them. And he actually sent me a video of one of these coming down like a rocket, this eagle. And that was the perfect bird for Serena. But what was really fun was then he started showing me how to train the bird. And one thing that Serena does in the novel, which I really enjoyed, was that you go into solitude with the bird. You don't eat, you don't sleep, it's almost like an act of will. And then eventually the bird will lower its head showing it's vulnerable. And so, but all that came from that. Yeah. That was my most fun.
I love that. I love that story. And I appreciate you spelling awe for us. A-W-E.
Yeah. Well, I was in Michigan a few years ago, and I was talking about a field being mown, and the woman said, "Well, how does a field mown? What kind of, I mean, it was like MOAN, and I was MOWN."
Yeah, you said, "Come on down to North Carolina. Our field's mown down here." With my first novel, I wanted to quote Faulkner's Barn Burning and call it The Old Fierce Pool of Blood. And my editor said, "Do you mean pool?" I was like, "Yeah, pool. He's like, "You're saying pool, like swimming pool. Like a swimming pool full of blood. Nobody's going to read that. That sounds like a horror novel."
What might it be like underneath the sunrise in a state of flight? Coming back on me, it seems wonderful, the wandering mountain birds on a beach. Never moments ever wasted, turning away from your love. Honeybees, gardens of sweeter fruit never tasted, no turning to other things. Will you be, will you seem? Sweeter fruit never tasted, don't turn your back on me. Mountains pushing into the sea.